Okay, so today we'll be talking about a man whom I call the Noble Radical, and that's Charles Lennox, the 3rd Duke of Richmond, who I find quite an interesting character for a number of reasons, which I will outline to you guys today. So, on 22nd of February 1735, Charles Lennox, the 2nd Duke of Richmond, and his wife, Sarah Cadogan, welcomed into the world a son, whom they named Charles, after the father. The young Charles received the upbringing that was typical to many of the aristocracy's sons at the time. He was educated at Westminster School, alongside some very famous people such as Warren Hastings, William Cowper and Edward Gibbon, of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and he was then sent on a grand tour of the continent before enrolling as a student at Leiden University in the Netherlands. The grand tour was a rite of passage for most aristocratic youths at the time, whilst in theory it was meant to be all about education. For them it often consisted more of endless parties and womanising. And to be sure, Lennox enjoyed himself, but he also applied himself to his studies in art as well. A career in the army awaited the young man. At the time it was fairly easy for an aristocrat to rise through the ranks of the British Army, because rich families often purchased military appointments for their sons. It was a means through which the sons of aristocratic families might make a name for themselves in the world. Lennox received his commission during the 7 Years' War and, by contemporary accounts at least, distinguished himself with bravery at the battles of Cherbourg and the capture of Quebec. By 1765, Lennox returned home and began seeking a career in politics. Through the connection of fellow friends in the House of Lords, Lennox was invited to become Secretary of State in May 1766 in the Duke of Rockingham's ministry. At the time, the electorate voted for MPs, but ministries were appointed by the king, who could hire or fire governments at will. Although he did have to take account, that's the king had to take account of who held the most power in the Commons. What parties as existed were often grouped around prominent individuals. Lennox was a member of the Rockingham Whigs. Some attached themselves to others, such as the Duke of Newcastle or the Earl of Chatham. Cabinet members like Lennox could come from either the House of Commons or the House of Lords. It was during this early phase of his political career that Lennox began to express serious reservations about the role of the king, at this time George III, in the Constitution. Lennox had witnessed the formation of 3 ministries in 3 years due to the various manoeuvrings of the king. Richmond began to wonder whether the government was merely the tool of the king, who, as soon as MPs bring in legislation he did not like, merely fired them. As Richmond stated to a friend in a private letter, "The administration are never changed but when they are getting strong enough to do the country some real service." Lennox, who had always disliked George III on a personal level, and believe me the feeling was mutual, began to form in his mind even more objections to this state of constitutional affairs. How could it be right that the government, once elected, can be disposed of by the king, and the ministers be sacked by their appointments, when their appointments had been the will of the electors? In Lennox's view, it was the ministers who should dictate terms to the king, and not the other way around. By the 1770s, Lennox was out of government, but took a keen interest in the affairs of state from the House of Lords. He disagreed with the Declaratory Act, passed back in 1766, which granted the United Kingdom Parliament the right to legislate for the colonies, and Richmond made private suggestions to Rockingham that someone in government ought to repeal it. He watched with horror the government's treatment of the American colonists, whose demands for the repeal of certain taxes and the hated Quartering Acts spilled out over into outright rebellion. And you can see a print on the screen here from around 1774, illustrating the Boston Tea Party, which was, of course, a famous precursor to the American Revolution. Lennox stopped short, however, of criticising the government openly. This was probably wise, because public opinion in England at the time of the American War was almost wholly with the government. When news reached England of the colonists' defeat at Long Island in 1776, for example, people in Leeds, Manchester, Bristol, York and Halifax celebrated in the streets and burnt effigies of George Washington, John Adams, John Hancock and Arthur Lee. At most, as the war began to go badly for the British, Lennox simply urged the government to recognise the colony's independence immediately. But of course that was a war which would drag on until 1783. Meantime, Lennox began corresponding with Major John Cartwright, the author of Take Your Choice, and began reading the works of Thomas Paine, a very influential voice in the American Revolution. Richmond came to sympathise with the goals of many political reform societies, such as the Yorkshire Association, who campaigned for universal male suffrage and annual elections. Yet these groups, although they were prolific publishers, had very few friends in high places. It was probably his exposure to Cartwright's and Paine's radical ideas, and his sympathies with the Yorkshire Association, that moved Lennox in 1780 to present a bill to the House of Lords. The preamble declared that the government of this realm and the making of laws for the same ought to be lodged in the hands of the King, Lords and Parliament, and representatives of the whole body of the freemen of this realm, that every man of the commonalty, excepting infants, insane persons and criminals, is of common right, and by the laws of God a free man, and entitled to the full enjoyment of liberty. And that liberty or freedom consists in having an actual share in the appointing of those who frame the laws, and who are to be the guardians of every man's life, property and peace. For the all of one man is as dear to him as the all of another, and the poor man has an equal right, but more need, to have representatives in the legislature than the rich one. This was effectively the draft of a constitution for the British people. Given that all men should have a right to have a say in the government, the bill further proposed a vote for all people over 21 years old, annual elections, and the creation of 558 constituencies containing an equal number of electors. Lennox's emphasis on people rather than simply men must give us pause for thought here. It might be inferred that he included women in this progressive scheme. With the exception of the preamble, the terminology used throughout the bill is largely gender neutral. Richmond refers to the right of every commoner, or the rights of the commons. Indeed, when the bill spoke about people who would not be able to vote, all we read is the following: "Who shall not vote, and be it enacted that no person who has been or shall be duly convicted in a court of law within this realm of the crimes of high treason, murder, felony, perjury, forgery, grand or petty larceny, or any of them, shall be capable of being elected, or of voting for the election of a member of Parliament in or for any borough within this kingdom." Cartwright had in fact reviewed the bill privately before Richmond presented it to the Lords, and offered suggestions on several points. So the idea of keeping the terminology vague may in fact have been Cartwright's idea. Major John Cartwright was in fact an early advocate of true universal suffrage, which included the granting of the right to vote to women as well. It was a far-reaching and progressive bill, which, unfortunately, Lennox's fellow aristocrats were not quite ready to endorse. Indeed, circumstances were conspiring against Lennox's bill. It would never get a fair hearing. Unfortunately for Lennox, the very day that his bill was presented to the Lords on 3rd of June in 1780, there was a commotion outside of Parliament. The commotion was occasioned by the recent passage of the Catholic Relief Act in 1778. The government in London had thought it prudent to extend to Catholics certain rights. As we have seen, Catholics had been bending over backwards to prove their loyalty to the Hanoverian regime, and the conciliatory approach seemed to be working, and by the late 1770s there seemed to be, in the words of Robert E. Burns, a good rapport between the king and his Catholic subjects. The Act required Catholics to swear loyalty to George III and renounce any loyalty to the deposed Stuart monarchy. If Catholics took the oath, they would be allowed to purchase freehold and leasehold land, live in London, found their own schools, and they would be permitted to join the British Army. A growing empire needed soldiers after all. The Act passed through Parliament in 1778 without a single dissenting voice. Now, the man leading the crowd of around 60,000 people outside Parliament was Lord George Gordon, a bigoted anti-Catholic nobleman from Scotland and leader of the Protestant Association. He and the crowd were there to deliver a petition calling on the government to repeal the Catholic Relief Act. He had been ignored by the King and the Cabinet for 2 whole years. Now he turned up to Parliament in a show of strength. The crowd became restless. They attacked the carriages of several Lords members as they turned up, the very people who would be called upon to debate and vote upon Lennox's bill. The crowd got even more angry and began attacking several embassies, and the riots descended into a week-long period of carnage when the protesters began attacking all symbols of government authority, until the army was called in to quell the rebellion. And this is a painting from the 19th century by John Seymour Lucas of when the army was finally called in to put down the rioting in London in 1780. No wonder then that on the 3rd of June the Lords rejected Lennox's bill. Richmond remained quiet about his radical politics after 1780. He took various roles in the government until the end of his life. He was Master of the Ordnance in William Pitt the Younger's first ministry, and remained closely allied with the Pittite Tories until the 1790s. Events such as the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror had cooled Richmond's appetite for political reform even further. He certainly offered no opposition to the government's suspension of habeas corpus and their implementation of measures designed to suppress freedom of speech and assembly in 1794. Fearing that the Reign of Terror would spread over to England, the government passed the above measures to curb the activities of British radical campaign groups, whose aim were the same as those presented in Lennox's bill in 1780, universal suffrage. Broadside entitled To the Affrighted Nobles excoriated the Duke of Richmond for his apostasy. As it says, "You have fled to the standard of corruption, for fear of losing your titles and estates, by which you have exposed the former to general contempt and the latter to danger. You have, all on a sudden, deserted the cause of the people, and instead of becoming their leaders on the day of trial, have, as it were, declared against the liberties of mankind." Harsh words indeed, yet the government pressed on with trying to suppress the activities of radical political groups. 3 men bore the brunt of this crackdown on radical political clubs. The men were John Fellwall, John Horntuck, and Thomas Hardy. These 3 men of the London Corresponding Society were arrested in 1794. Their crime? Campaigning for the same things which Lennox had included in his bill in the summer of 1780. Richmond's bill was quite handy for the defence of these men, and Richmond's bill was alluded to several times during the men's trial, as their counsel stated to the jury. When the Corresponding Society first introduced its proceedings, their objects were avowed and expressed to be those of Richmond. There is no statute of limitation upon treason. This might equally be brought forward many years hence as now. This that was published by the Duke of Richmond was not considered by the officers of the Crown as a libel, for if it is not too late, if the Attorney General thinks such a proceeding would be decent, to call to account Richmond who published it. This was a clever argument indeed, If you're going to prosecute Horntuck, Hardy and Felwall, then you must prosecute Richmond as well. The case against Horntuck and his fellow radicals was dismissed. The jurors could plainly see that the charges were trumped up, and no one would want to indict a lord like Richmond, who had advocated the same things a decade and a half earlier. The whole thing proved to be an embarrassment for the government. Lennox died in 1806 at his home on Goodwood Estate. He does not currently occupy a major place in the history of English radicalism. No doubt his conversion to Pittite Toryism is a factor in this. Yet early in the 19th century, radical publishers began reprinting his bill, and they used it as a basis for their own cause in the fight for universal suffrage.